Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Emma Amon. I'm the Senior Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. And one of my jobs here today is to troubleshoot any tech issues that you may encounter. So if you do have any issues throughout this webinar, please feel free to message me in the chat box. Today's webinar will start off with a presentation from the authors of the Climate Change and Homelessness, a Global Response Framework. We will then move on to a question and answer period. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box below and we'll get to them after the presentation. Thank you so much. Off to you, Sean.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma. And thanks so much to everyone who's been able to join today, wherever you may be calling from. And we'll start things off with just a few introductions and walk through a bit of a plan for the presentation today. So I'm Sean Kidd. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm a senior scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health here in Toronto, and I'm faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. So I'll pass it over to Maria, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Thanks, Sean. So my name is Maria Biscobelna, and I'm a PhD candidate at York University in psychology, and I'm also a research trainee at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, that's working with Sean there. And I think that's good enough for now. Let's start our presentation.
Great. Yeah, and I should note that where I personally am connecting in from is on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Haudenosaunee and several other First Nations. And I think that this presentation has particular relevance to Indigenous populations globally. So it's all the more important to acknowledge the land that I'm broadcasting from here, and perhaps you can reflect a little bit on the land that you're on while you're connecting in with our presentation. Okay, so I'm just going to get us started here. Okay, so what we hope to do today is we're going to walk through a little bit of high-level background on the general pieces, because many of you will be familiar with those, and those are pieces that are quite readily accessible through a range of sources, and we're going to take a much deeper dive on our main topic, which is the risks and the challenges, as well as the opportunities for intervening surrounding homelessness and climate change. Maria and I are going to take turns presenting, and what we hope to do is to leave a good amount of time at the end for some Q&A and for some discussion. You will see that this presentation is being recorded, so hopefully that's okay with you. And what we're going to do is post the recording on our website for those that couldn't join today, and they can watch it later on. And in the course of the presentation, we've got our web address up here. Maybe Maria, you could drop that into the chat. That's where you can find a lot of material related to what we're talking about. We're going to be presenting on a framework that we've developed in terms of responding to the climate change pressures faced by homeless populations. And of course, in a presentation like this, we'll only be able to cover some kind of example pieces, but you'll have plenty of opportunity to access and read in detail, all of what we pulled together. A few acknowledgements and disclosures to get started. This work was funded by the Canadian Tri-Council, so this is a combination of SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR that came together on a knowledge mobilization funding track called Living Within the Earth's Carrying Capacity. We have no disclosures to make related to conflicts of interest, and it's important to acknowledge that this certainly isn't just the work of Maria and myself. There are several authors of the framework that we're going to present on who are named here, and they in turn are representative of a broader network of many experts in the space who have contributed in different ways to the ideas and the thoughts that we've pulled together here. And as I mentioned, you can access all these materials on our website. Okay, so I'm just gonna move this over a little bit. There we go. All right, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Okay, so what we hope to do is to speak a little bit broadly and fairly light touch way about the implications of climate change for vulnerable populations or populations that are marginalized or equity seeking. We're going to really drill down much more on the major implications for health and well-being at the intersection of climate change, housing precarity, and homelessness. And I should say right off the bat that we look at homelessness, of course, as a dimensional construct. It can be quite vague and difficult to define, but homelessness can refer to everything from a complete lack of shelter, or street homelessness as it's sometimes called, right on through to inadequate housing, where a person might have some sort of physical shelter, but it's either temporary, unstable, or is just not an adequate facility to have a reasonable quality of life in. And then most importantly, and the reason why we're here, is to present on a response framework that we've pulled together on how we might address this major and growing global challenge. So I know many of you are going to be very well versed in the health implications of climate change, but just to do a bit of level setting, and especially if there's some folks connecting in who are a little bit newer to this topic, wanted to cover just some of the basics here. And at the bottom, you'll see a Lancet, kind of the header from a really important Lancet review and recommendations document, the Lancet Countdown. It is really a great place to go if you want to go to one place that really captures well the health implications of climate change. So I'm just going to go through some of the main themes, and then we'll dive into our topic. So, many of you will be aware, of course, heat exposure has a range of impacts. Everything from early development and what the maternal risks that are unique at the time of pregnancy, right on through to all populations around things like respiratory illness, cardiac disease, and a range of other challenges. And the greatest exposure to risk for these kinds of challenges will tend to be the very young and very old. The young in terms of the implications for development, and the elderly in terms of implications related to compromised and challenged health. There are direct impacts with things like storms and heat, but then of course, climate change impacts our ability to be out working, exercising, and engaging in the world, which has a range of impacts: economic, health as a health determinant, as well as quality of life. You've got risks around mortality and injury related to extreme weather events, storms and fires, and then secondary pieces like smoke pollutant exposure. It can be smoke from fires. It can be the intersection between climate change and air pollution. Disease exposure, whether it's water, airborne, or vector-borne disease. All of these things intersect with climate change and of course have a huge range of health impacts. Food, water, and energy insecurity, of course, come with this, and perhaps a little bit less addressed in a lot of the discourse is the intersection between climate change and displacement, where there's people's livelihoods and homes being compromised, and violence as well, violence ranging from interpersonal and domestic violence on through to sort of more regional and country level conflicts, which have some association with climate change as well, and all the pressures. So you can kind of see a lot of different variables that all come together to really challenge people's health and well-being. And I should say too that just like the COVID-19 pandemic did, climate change is an amplifier of disparities. So when people are lacking resource, and whether it's lacking resource, experiencing poverty in a high-income country like Canada, or more at a country level, such as in low-income countries, is climate change amplifies disparities and amplifies those challenges, because people with less resource are far more affected, whether it's related to already compromised health, malnutrition, those kinds of challenges, more exposure to violence, less shelter, and less resource to respond and try to adapt to climate pressures. As you might imagine, it's quite a different thing to lose your second home in Florida to a storm as compared with somebody that loses their home and livelihood in a place like Bangladesh, for many different reasons. So this is just a very high level scan of some of the key considerations, but I really encourage you to turn to the Lancet report and other sources if you want more on this, because there's a lot written and a lot being addressed here. So kind of coming to what was the starting point for this whole effort, is I must admit being relatively new to the area of climate change and science, aside from just being a concerned citizen like like everyone in this call is reading the New York Times and books and Naomi Klein, and trying to get my head around what's happening in the world and the implications for the people I care about and the world I care about. But I have spent a lot of my life doing research with and providing services to and trying to engage in advocacy and policy work for populations experiencing homelessness. And that's included many hours out in very cold and wet and very hot environments, speaking with people who are suffering in these environments and living without adequate shelter, without shelter entirely. And it struck me a couple of years ago that, I'd never really read much about the climate change implications for homelessness in the academic literature. I know that services are out handing out water bottles. There are the out of the cold shelters, and there are the warming centers and the cooling centers that cities will do as pop-ups kind of during weather extremes. In many cities, walking home from work, I'll give people water bottles that I see sleeping rough, but living rough, but I hadn't really read anything much about it. So that led me to start to do a side of the desk systematic review or scoping review in this area. And the grant came around, and that allowed me to start working with Maria. But it really kind of started this whole program. And what we discovered was there's really, in the academic literature, as well as more generally, there's really a lack of decent attention, given the scope and scale of the problems, which are enormous. The amount of literature, what's known about this problem and these intersecting issues is very small, and in terms of evidence and really trying to understand how we can respond. And so that's what's really motivated both Maria and myself and all of the colleagues we've engaged to try and come together to see what we can do in making recommendations and to bring more attention to what we think is an important issue. And this was me in Canada thinking about this, and coming to see and really appreciate to a much greater extent the global frame of climate change, all around the world. And of course, I've mentioned already that the countries least contributing to global climate change are, of course, the most impacted. And this is a global issue. In Canada, the things that will be most concerned and aware of are exposures to storms and extreme temperature and so on. But in other parts of the world, the picture on the upper left here is a slum in Nairobi, Kenya, and that's where many hundreds of thousands have migrated from climate-affected regions to live in very inadequate housing and get exposed to all kinds of weather extremes and floods and disease, and with many people dying, particularly infants and children as a result of that. And the picture in the lower right is from Brazil. And that's people trying to use found materials to survive fast weather shifts and extremes while living outside. And it's just really this is a problem that really resonates and is truly a global issue, and is particularly impactful in lower income settings or in low income settings within medium and higher income countries. And so summarizing kind of the efforts to date, I've already touched on this, is just a few high points here is in terms of inclusion in disaster response plans, there's very little inclusion of people who are lacking housing. And this is, of course, extremely important. You can imagine in a situation like a hurricane, when first responders don't have a plan for how to support, locate, and help people without housing, who are of course the most exposed in those scenarios. Lack of routine inclusion and climate adaptation remediation planning, and this has issues where some of the adaptations to housing are quite costly, and some of the city level adaptations, such as efforts to increase the canopy through trees, can kind of backfire and take a gentrification frame and actually cause more more housing pressures for people experiencing poverty. So this is another area where there's been a lack of inclusion. And then lastly, most of the responses that we know of and that have been done are, like I mentioned, tend to be these sort of reactive ad hoc responses. I mean, certainly it's helpful and reaching out to people and trying to help people understand what heat stroke is and giving out water bottles and these sorts of things. These probably do save lives. but it's certainly not adequate to have as a response is this kind of thing where already strapped services are trying to figure out ad hoc what they can do for people who are dying and suffering in street environments and in inadequate housing with these weather extremes. Okay, so our effort here, and we did a number of pieces of work, is we're trying to come up with a response framework. So we're not just describing the problems and the pressures, but we do want to really focus on what can we do about this at all levels. And so a big part of our effort has been trying to figure out what the parameters and what the best process is to head towards such a framework. And we've also been trying to, as best we can, especially through a pandemic frame, is engage the lived experience side and bring some visuals to this, bring this to life. And we engaged a photographer named Marco Hovnanian from Brazil, and some of the images that you'll see in our report are in fact his work, where he documented in Brazilian urban environments how people were using found materials to try and survive extreme cold, extreme heat in those environments, to sort of make this more tangible. And we look forward to doing more lived experience engagement in the future in this area. Okay, so maybe I think, yeah, I'm on for the next 2 slides, just get myself oriented here. So where did this information come from that you'll find in our response framework and what we're talking about here? There's a couple of systematic reviews that were done. One is directly looking at homelessness and climate change. And the second is a review of reviews, where we want to look at a higher level at the implications of climate change for people with inadequate housing and poverty more broadly in those areas. We held a whole bunch of think tank events through the pandemic, and I can't thank enough members of our international network of experts who, I guess it was the fall of 2020, got an email from this guy from Canada who wanted to get people together to talk about this issue and to try and figure out what we can do about it. And the response was great, and people were very generous with their time and with their ideas as we tried to pull this together. I've already mentioned the parameters challenges. This has been a challenging task because I've already talked about how murky the construct of homelessness can be. But it can, when you get into migration, exposure, and how climate change can have effects in different areas and with different climate pressures, you can imagine the complexity really mounts, and it can get hard to figure out where you draw lines. One thing that we're passionately focused on, as much as the topic itself, is I don't know about you all, but it's so easy to get lost in the many overlapping and parallel efforts in the area of climate change and health, and how climate change is affecting human populations, that it can get very confusing. And the last thing we want to do is to add more confusion. So you'll see through our report and in all that we do is we're very much trying to align what we can offer with already existing organized and large scale efforts to advocate, to advise policymakers and system leaders. And that's just trying to add this nuance, add this piece about considering homelessness as important. Like, for example, there's quite a large body of work around climate change and migration globally. And the piece that we can add there is migration to what? And I think this is an important topic because for many, the migration is to increasing levels of poverty and homelessness. So yeah, so those are just a few thoughts and a little bit of an overview about where this information is from. And this is my last slide before I hand it off to Maria. It's certainly, and this is something that kind of weaves its way through, and just a few thoughts on how I think we need to think about this issue of climate change and homelessness is first, this is very much a wicked problem. And some of you might be familiar with this term. It's a term that refers to a problem that has many parallel and interacting problems within it. It's the result of a number of problems. It in turn causes additional problems downstream, and there are all kinds of feedback loops. You probably heard about the vicious cycle of homelessness is a term sometimes thrown around in popular media, but a negative feedback loop. And the example here is, for example, when let's say it's a family that loses their housing and then is moving towards a slum outside an urban environment, is as home is lost, as cultures are detached from, as livelihoods are lost, and as this family gets more and more marginalized, the problems that they face compound exponentially, and this is what's called a negative feedback loop. And the implications for all of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is it's really key that we focus on prevention, because the further downstream we get in any of these areas and any of these pressures, the more complicated and the more expensive it is to respond, and the less impactful our responses can be. Another implication of looking at climate change and homelessness as a complex systems problem is the idea of leverage. No illusions that we have well-funded systems related to homelessness. We don't have that in Canada, a very high income context, let alone in low income contexts. So in these contexts, where you could be doing 20 or 30 different things to address this crisis, it's just not going to happen. The funding and resource isn't there. So with a complex systems idea, you have to look at points of leverage, and this is where where are there places to respond where you get the biggest bang for your buck, basic, to put it in a simple way, where you have the biggest impact for the least resource, because we're in a resource strapped area. And so that's why our framework is consistently prioritizing points of leverage, and these are points of leverage that are identified through systematic reviews with examples to try and look at where governments and system leaders can have the biggest impact with limited resources. And then lastly, a theme here is we just need better data. It's an area where we're lacking, because in a complex systems frame, you need good data, good population level data, to understand where these points of leverage are, and how we can get more on the side of prevention. And this is a matter of merging climate science related data, where we can understand where these pressures are occurring and how, but then also understanding what populations are likely to be affected, and that way we can get in a more preventative frame. So I am going to pass it on to Maria, and Maria is going to start to walk you through what our framework, how it came together, what the issues were, and give you a few examples. Like I've been saying, is you can go to the actual document and read a lot about it, but we'll just give you a bit of a teaser here. So Maria, you can take it away, and you can just cue me when you want a slide to change.
Great, thank you, Sean. So in developing the framework, we were aiming to get a document that is easy to navigate, but that covers all of the main issues that have been identified through the reviews and through the think tanks. First of all, as Sean already mentioned, we were focused on aligning the analysis regarding the terms and especially the strategies that are already being used by various organizations and systems, such as the SDG, WHO, and various UN organizations. Then we decided that we need to give a brief outline of the key considerations. And basically that provides an overall overview of the issues that everyone can go into more in-depth by clicking on the links and reading on more information that is interesting to whichever area you are focused on. So finally, we also differentiate as a function of climate-associated pressures, population characteristics, and socio-political geographic context, because climate change and homelessness, both of the topics look very different in various areas of the world, and even within the same area, it can look differently depending on different characteristics. And finally, we try to create list of cross-cutting principles that should be applied to the development of different local practices or the guidance that people need. So we came up with two major themes, one being migration and the other being exposure. So for each of the sections, we provide a brief overview, like I said, of what it is. So there are some direct risks and then, such as loss of housing that can be moderated by various factors, for instance, refugee planning and management, and that will lead to specific outcomes for different populations, such as increases in poverty, homelessness, and vulnerability. Next slide, please. So types of climate-driven migration pressures leading to homelessness can be divided into three different areas: rural-urban migration, which is the most significantly covered one because it increases when climate shocks influence agriculture or other livelihood that depends on the land. These type of migration can frequently lead to homelessness because the rural migrants may lack the education and training needed to find jobs within the urban areas where they move to. Next, there's an urban-urban migration, and it seems that this type of migration occurs mostly in response to prolonged heat periods that interfere with labor productivity. So people trying to increase their chances of having a stable job by moving to another urban center within their own country. And finally, there is external migration. However, there is a lack of consistent data gathering, and there are difficulties in tracking and attributing slow onset climate change migration. Also, when people migrate to a different country, they usually have a number of different factors combining, so it can be difficult to attribute it specifically to climate pressures. So the outcomes for migration can be increases in poverty, homelessness, violence exposure, and increased inequality. And migration can also be linked with physical and mental health problem and mortality, and the difficulties in finding sustained livelihoods in the new environment. So this excerpt is taken exactly from the framework. If you would click on one of the highlighted areas, Sean, can you just click?
Sorry, that might take me out of presentation mode.
No, just click on the screen. It will.
Oh, there we go. Okay, there we
go. Yeah. So for instance, if you click on poverty, can you click more? Another click on the screen. Yep, and one more. Sorry about this. It takes you to an article.
We needed a dress rehearsal.
Yes, sorry about that. So it will take you to an article, and in this document we gathered not just our articles and reviews from journals. Sometimes we would draw on existing books or reports that are very specific to the issues. Some of them are more general in nature. Some of them are specific to different areas of the world or specific situations. So with poverty, for instance, it takes you to an article that discusses the economic interaction between climate change mitigation, climate migration, and poverty. And in this instance, the main ideas would be that climate change mitigation needs to happen before climate change pressures kick in, because at that point it's too late to mitigate. There's already a need for a response. And in that situation, many people living in poverty would already try to migrate and find different livelihood elsewhere. And it also addresses the issue that there needs to be a greater coordination between the poor or lower income individuals and the rich individuals, which is the same is true for countries in general. It's frequently mentioned, but rich countries really need to step in to help the developing countries in mitigating climate change issues. Next, please. And then we would go into migration examples. So with targeted responses. So the first one would be trying to facilitate staying in place by remediating the risks. And the next step would be planning migration, which frequently increases the chances for people to have sustainable livelihood once they move. The first step there, again, is improving low quality housing. Can you click again? So here how it looks in the document was the prevention being the key consideration. And if you click on the first link there, improvements to low quality housing, it will guide you to an article that discusses building resilience to climate change and informal settlements. The specific article looked at lower and middle income cities and it discusses different areas of improvements for informal settlements that increases the chances of mitigation and resilience for local communities. And this doesn't really have to be specific to climate change. Even improving local infrastructure, like getting more buses so that people can get to work, or improving the access to clean water, really increases the resilience of local communities. Next, please. So the next key theme is exposure. Again, we have direct risks, such as heat, which is very prominent now given the summer coming, which can be moderated by various factors such as chronic illness and malnourishment, which leads to outcomes such as illness, morbidity, injury, and mortality. Next. And the types of climatic events like to increase exposure include temperature extremes, as we have mentioned, natural disasters, food and water insecurity, disease, and air pollution. Depending on the city, air pollution can be very prominent. It's especially prominent for urban areas, of course. So for outcomes, we have increases in illness, morbidity, mortality, injury, violence, exposure, and mental health issues, and increases in emergency service use and infrastructure burden. And in this case, if you would click on mental health issues, it would guide you to, can you click 2 more times, please? To a document on specific to the United States, where you can look at mental health and well-being chapter that discusses the impact of various extreme events on mental health, which are exacerbated for people living in poverty or in homelessness situation. And they discuss the need for, especially during heat events, because it really exacerbates the pre-existing health condition and mental health conditions. Next, please. So, for example, for the example, we look into response strategies again. So localized approaches using co-design and peer-to-peer engagement in education supplies and housing-related strategies is key. Through various research articles that we have seen and through conversations with practitioners in the field, it seems that co-design practices that involve local residents and people with lived experience tend to give the best results in terms of their response strategies, both in terms of building the response strategies that is very relevant to local communities, and also a response strategies that is more easily adapted and more welcomed by the community itself. And can you click? So, for instance, when developing an international response strategy, we can look for global exchange of knowledge through training and support initiatives. And a really good article on that discusses the collaborative educational approaches in Western Indian Ocean region, where representatives from different countries and from different walks of life and interests, such as practitioners, researchers, academics, NGO involvement, and local governments together identified the key areas in which they required more knowledge and more current practices that are being used. The training was designed then with these key considerations in mind and provided to the local practitioners. And another key element was that the training that is being provided needs to enable the participants to train the next generation so that they can pass on the knowledge and don't have to rely on external experts coming in and giving these training and external context. For example, for this one, because it was such a large scale involving different countries, they had to all gather together in one country, which involves a lot of planning and bringing people together, for which not many people may have time and which can be more difficult as recent COVID experience shows. Next, please. So one of the most important points that we have identified as the cross-cutting principles that need to be integrated into various stages of planning and implementation for the responses. So there is a great need to focus on more prevention and generating data, which emphasizes adequate housing. The data generation seems very prominent because once you have the data for the specific local community, it's much easier to develop a strategy, and it becomes a lot less costly to develop and implement the strategy. Then, as we mentioned previously, there needs to be greater inclusion of lived experience with provider engagement and especially end user engagement. Also, there need to be localized solutions aligned with existing values and practices. Again, there are examples of different response strategies that have been developed by local governments without consulting the communities themselves. And in some cases, that such strategies fail. People do not want to relocate to the areas that have been chosen, or they do not want to engage in the activities that have been provided to them as a potential for livelihood sustainability. And finally, equity needs to be front and center. There needs to be consideration of how different populations within different contexts, such as women and children, can be engaged, or and different cultural and religious peoples can be engaged as well. Okay, on to Sean. I think that's you, Sean, now.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I will just conclude here just with a few ideas about next steps and where we need to go. And these should all make sense just based on some of the things we've been talking about. So we lack information. We lack an understanding about, this intersection of climate change and homelessness and how it indexes, or how it's expressed and experienced, and its implications across a range of different settings. And so, a good strategy, one that we're looking at, our group's looking at in terms of next steps, is to do some case studies with mixed methods to try and understand what are the unique challenges in different places, and what are the opportunities to respond, and whether those opportunities to respond are considered at a policy or systems leadership level, or right on through to sort of a service and community-based level. So that, I think, is an important step. Trying to better data, this has been a running theme, and trying to figure out where is there existing data that could be used to track, identify risk, and identify opportunities for prevention. The pandemic has led to actually, ironically, because of all of the challenges that it posed, there are actually some better and emerging data sets that came out of the pandemic. But nonetheless, as is always the case, we have the most data about the people that need help the least. Really impoverished populations and populations experiencing homelessness, we often are missing a lot of really good systematic data. But trying to get better data, where are the data sets that might be relevant, and how can we use them, is another step. Moving upstream, again, this prevention theme is we want to understand and see how we can support people who are living rough or living in slums and other forms of abject poverty. But can we move upstream and do some retrospective work to try and understand what are the pathways to that most extreme scenario, and where are the points at which we could intervene in different ways? I mentioned it earlier on about negative feedback loops, or the vicious cycle of homelessness, is the more upstream we can get, the more straightforward it becomes to intervene, and more cost effective in all senses. Articulating, testing, and scaling responses. So this is just, we need to build interventions of different kinds, whether it's a policy intervention or a psychosocial intervention, testing them and trying to scale them out. And we don't have time, particularly for slow science, where we spend many years and many careers perhaps trying to understand what the issues are. This is a space where we need to much more rapidly enter a mode of figuring out when data is good enough, and when we can start doing some tests and have more rapid iterations of tests and scales. And sure, many will fail, but we need to do some essentially some riskier research in terms of investment to respond faster, because we don't, as you probably heard extensively through a range of outlets, this is an area that we can't take the next 30 years as sort of articulating a response because of the urgency of this issue and the number of people suffering and dying because of it. And then lastly, I've mentioned already, we want to work synergistically with many other organized efforts to respond. But we hope to provide information that can be useful for large groups and much larger efforts that are engaged in really important advocacy work and awareness raising work that ultimately, it's going to be a large scale collective effort in many areas. And the housing piece is one slice of it. And we hope to provide something useful to those groups that are doing that important work. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen and bring us up here. So that's our presentation, and this is our kind of our first crack at this. We notice did not have perfect coordination on the slides, but hopefully we did figure it out fairly quickly. But this is hot off the press. We probably will continue to tinker with this framework, but we did hit a point where we found okay, it's good enough to go, and we're getting it out there in the world for some feedback, and we'll continue to refine as we get better information and get better feedback from people. So with that, I'll stop and then just see, we can open the floor for any questions. So I see, I'll just pull up the chat here, and Emma's going to help shepherd us through this. And I'll just see, Kristen has a question here. Interesting question about data, one we're thinking about too. Do you have a sense of the specific questions or data gaps that you need to fill? We often have to find a balance between having perfect data and acting on things that we know will be helpful. And it's a great question, Kristen. This is, in terms of data gaps, I can give a few examples. So one data gap is I think, let's take the example of migration. Where can we identify communities that are uniquely vulnerable and highly likely to have their housing compromised in the near future? And I think that's a gap where there is an opportunity for governments to engage, to look at what can be done, whether it's a planned migration strategy, if it just seems like it's kind of there's no viable response, or helping people stay in place. So I think that's one example of a gap that has some good promise in terms of being able to build an intervention. And the second data gap, that's sort of a population data gap. A second data gap I think we have is we have very little on what interventions work, and whether we can think of it as a maybe a systems design intervention, or even an outreach based intervention, as we don't have, there's almost no trial evidence, or even just outcome evidence on what can be done, what works, and where and how and for whom. So I mean, these are all questions where there's really a lack, and a striking lack, and just lacking information. So and the idea of perfect data, I think that speaks to, if we have some outcome studies, maybe not well controlled, and but just show promise in terms of feasibility, is kind of perhaps moving fairly quickly towards implementation rather than waiting for the definitive trial, even though that's the best case scenarios. We can have large scale effectiveness trials, of course, of interventions, but do we jump more quickly to implementation and see, does it fall on its face, gather more data on its way? You can use the pragmatic trial framing of maybe not as many controls as you have to do in community-based research. So I'll stop there. Those are just a few thoughts off the top, but I'd be interested if you want to kind of elaborate or certainly add anything.
No, thank you so much. Well, first of all, thanks to both of you, Maria and Sean, for the presentation. It's been really, really interesting and great stuff. And yeah, I've just recently taken over as the manager of the resilience team at the Greater London Authority. So I was working on climate adaptation before, still working on climate adaptation, but kind of taking on a new role of like a wider remit. And data is something that just comes up a lot. But I also remember from climate change adaptation that there's a lot of people saying, well, we'll act as long as we, as soon as we get some like more perfect data, as long as we get more information. And I'm always kind of going, yeah, but we sort of know there are things that will help, potentially. So that's why I asked the question. And I think we're looking at that as, part of our program, and, what data do we need? And I really want to consider this as, this topic and this issue as one of the things that we're including in there. So yeah, it's really it's really helpful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's great comments, Krista. And thanks so much, by the way, for taking this call at the end of your week. You're well into
That's
well
all
into
right. I was
the
looking forward to it.
And, it brings to mind, I mean, and this would be something for us to think about, is there are other frames, thinking about things like, Ebola response, where, fast science can be done, and there are frameworks for setting the thresholds at good enough, not waiting for definitive, trials, these sorts of things. And I think this could be good to look at, to see from other contexts where there is a crisis, is how those decisions, is there other algorithms we can use where action is needed more quickly, and we can't wait for the 20-year bench to bedside gap sort of phenomenon.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, Anne-Marie, yes, we will share the presentation. We'll have it up on the website probably quite soon. I would imagine at least by next week, so you'll be able to find the link there. So if anyone else wants to add a question through the chat, or just you can throw up your hand or just jump in.
I did get a question to my personal inbox, so I'll share this for the registrant. So the question was, can you expand on why community-focused responses are particularly important?
Yeah. So, I think, it's because of course, the emphasis in the response to climate change tends to be, at the big government level. And that's, and I think that emphasis is well put, because there is a need for large scale national and international efforts, whether it's setting different kinds of standards, looking at how money flows, how funding flows, trying to build capacity and in a way that kind of filters down through many levels of government, and that's an emphasis. And I think running in parallel to that, and in many of the reviews and the work that we've done, is there's this emphasis on community responses. How can you help an individual community in trying to build its response to their own unique challenges that they face with inadequately housed populations and climate change? And I think this speaks to the complexity, where you need to sort of match the large government efforts with local efforts, because large scale government efforts won't be tuned into the unique nuances of a given community, especially marginalized communities, and especially within marginalized communities such as people experiencing homelessness, people who have the most challenging intersections, whether it's as a function of gender, or age, or a racialized identity, ethnicity. And so I think that's where there needs to be this sort of pairing of enablement and support from the big government level and international level, that then can be taken on by communities who are given the architecture and resources for response, but they can then implement and index the responses much more effectively. So I think that's how these things can, that's I think where this comes from, this emphasis on community. All right, so any other, okay, so see, Andrea's got a question. Do you have any additional reflections on migration seen as adaptation to climate change and the contradictions this approach presents? Yeah, so that's a great question. And Maria as well. I'm kind of talking a lot here. Maria, do you want to put you on the spot here? Do you want to jump in on this one, or do you want me to have a crack at it? Because I know that you spent quite a bit of time on this one.
No, why don't you go for it?
Okay, sure. So
sorry.
Yeah, so I guess I guess this is where I think and Andrea, I'd be interested in your thoughts here if you want to jump in, because you're highly expert in this area. Like what comes to mind for me is in adaptation efforts is how equity plays out, and who gets what assistance and how, and where more marginalized groups might not have access to that. And certainly there were some papers that spoke about some of the most impoverished and most compromised populations are in fact the ones that end up being left behind, whether it's organized, migration as an adaptation response, or it kind of is just happening as people are fleeing. But with the most grinding poverty is felt by those who can't even migrate. So I think, it's kind of one of those devils in the details. I imagine there are opportunities there, but then it's opportunities for who and how. But Andre, feel free, I don't put you on the spot here, but it'd be great to get your take on this question too. Oh, you lost your voice. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so hopefully that's his thought. Anna Maria, did you want to add anything to that, or did that cover things reasonably well?
I think that covers it.
Okay, great. Expanding how on the network can influence governments to act. I mean, I have no illusions about about the limits of building something like this, putting it on a website, doing some talks, and hoping for the best. And this is something I know it needs to happen. It's a part of the process. But I think this is where the work, the next stage, much more important stage of work, now that we've got this sort of foundation, is how as a network can we think about how to get this document, to get these messages in front of people who aren't thinking about these issues, or who are and are feeling like they lack any sense on how to proceed. And so I think this is going to be the subject of follow-up engagement with our network. And as our network has been steadily expanding, is to support individuals and groups in tailoring and taking these kind of general ideas, and how can they be put in front of government, and even thinking as a group, because in many contexts, it's not entirely clear who's on point for this issue. Sometimes it could be many different departments and ministries. That kind of homelessness and climate change can live in this sort of intersectoral, cross-government kind of realm. And as we know, certainly in many governments, as governments don't tend to do so well in these in-between places. They'll set up panels and committees, but they often lack the authority of just the more straightforward, like departments of health and or ministries of health and so on. So, I think one part mapping where the influence is and who can have an influence, and this will be from municipal to national levels. And then what messages from here, keeping it simple as we have to do, what messages will resonate. And so I think a part of the work of the network will be to look at how we can support our collective efforts in this area. I know certainly that this is something Maria and I are going to be very active on in Canada, and we'll look forward to supporting others. All right, I got props from Kristen on just so where it's tough, exactly, where nobody's really owning this particular challenge. From Mark Poppert, I've got, what strategies have you seen to be successful in addressing the stigmas or bias held by community response volunteers towards people experiencing homelessness? I am often met with either indifference or some variation of they already live outside and they are better prepared than the average person. And this certainly folds into something that probably we should have emphasized to a greater extent is people lacking housing, and all of the identities and labels and stories and narratives and images that kind of surround that are highly discriminated against and stigmatized globally. I think it's a big question, and I think there's going to be perhaps this is where some of the community level engagement can be important. The thing that works against stigma most effectively is when people can actually interact with those who have the labels and are seen in these stigmatizing and discriminated ways, and where it may be possible to bring those stories, first humanize and see that people experiencing a lack of housing have backgrounds, interests, experiences that have a lot of similarities and a lot of intersections with our own. And I think here, in some ways the pandemic had some lessons for us about the health of all of our society is directly related to the health of those who are the most marginalized. So I think trying to personalize it, trying to show that there's hope and that there are ways of engaging and ways of turning this around. And fundamentally, working at a whole government kind of way. Like ultimately, we should, especially, where we have resource in higher income settings, there's no reason why we should have so many chronically homeless people experiencing homelessness who have these exposures. So kind of working on that prevention and all the way through, trying to combat the stigma that gets in the way through education, awareness raising, and connecting people.
I can add to that a little bit by
please do.
saying that bringing on a person with lived experience who's already out of the homelessness can be very successful in these instances, because they're better situated to speak to the experiences of being homeless, but already having passed that, they're already they can reflect back on it without thinking of what is going to be my next meal, or where am I going to sleep tonight, because these issues are resolved for them. It's easier to identify exactly how one would go to about communicating with other homeless people, especially if it's possible to get somebody from within the community that is being addressed at the moment. It can be very successful.
All right, thanks, Maria. And I think we have time, with it being 4 minutes to go, for one last question. And thanks to Shirley for providing it. Flood impacts for First Nations around Lake St. Martin, where water was diverted by government to save Winnipeg, were badly impacted by homelessness. For 8 years of displacement, many people were moved from hotel to hotel. This lack of address for public housing in response by the province for First Nation people who are displaced, and seeing it as a federal response. Does this contribute to the problem? I think, you know, this really touches on something that comes up quite a lot in the report and in the papers that are behind the report, is this with in Canada, Indigenous, Métis and Inuit, and more globally, Indigenous populations are amongst the most affected in many different ways, and in many ways climate change and the responses to it, in this case, you know, sort of an adaptation response to a climate crisis, is kind of another representation of colonial violence, and then kind of it runs along a legacy, you know, the pollution, all of the pieces, and how Indigenous communities are impacted. It is all a part of this the various forms of violence and genocide that have happened. And so really, you know, I think it's sadly and tragically, these kinds of responses and how communities such as First Nations communities are affected, and in this instance, it sounds like a lack of prioritizing, a lack of organized response is, you know, it speaks to how Indigenous communities are amongst the most affected globally. And of course, with many Indigenous communities having very important cultural connections with the land, this goes far beyond just housing and towards a displacement around culture and identity. And there's many papers, especially in the far north of Canada, you see this papers on this topic, and where people are having these experiences. So yeah, it's a part of the picture, as well as, you know, as we look to responses and see who's behind responses. The Lancet report notes that when women are in more powerful positions in government, the countries involved have more robust climate change action plans. And there's much commentary about how Indigenous communities globally can be engaged as we seek solutions. So it's both looking at impacts, as well as seeing how Indigenous knowledge and presence can be brought into the solution. And I think that's where there's a great deal of promise too. So thanks for that question, and for prompting a greater discussion of this really important topic, Shirley. So with that, I just want to say thanks so much for taking some time out of your day, and Kristen, your early evening, for joining us. This is our first go at this. We're going to continue to tinker with these guidelines and this framework. And we're going to share it with our network, and we're going to be very busy as next steps, having a look at how we can bring these suggestions into action and get more data, because this is, like I mentioned, we're in early days, a lot of expert opinion, and the papers that did exist were put into this, but we have a lot more to learn. So I do hope you stay connected with us. Through our website's a good place to see what we're up to. And yeah, again, thanks so much, and I really appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, everyone, for coming over today.